There are a lot of things that make Atlus games stand out amongst the sea of video game developers throughout history. Picking just one part of their games that is considered their most notable aspect is difficult. For example, one might say that they are known for their engaging and varied battle systems, or the incredibly distinct atmosphere found in each entry of theirs. Some people could point to the masterful art from industry legends such as Kazuma Kaneko or Shigenori Sojima, or the groundbreaking narratives from directors like Koji Okada or Katsura Hashino. These are all more than acceptable answers. However, I would argue that there is one thing that brings all of these aspects into one package, and that would be the music. I personally got into Atlus games after watching and listening to the OG Persona 3 opening for the first time. I went to my closest retro video game store and bought Fez as soon as I could. I'm sure I'm not the only person who has been introduced to the company through music, as you could find Persona, SMT, and even Catherine tracks on any video game music to study to video online. However, I do feel like there is a lack of information online giving the composers for these games their flowers, and so I thought this video would be a good resource for anyone interested in the history of Atlus Sound Team. Now, some of you may be thinking, everyone who has been a fan of these games for a while should know who Shoji Meguro is. Which, yes, is true, but other composers throughout Atlus history are incredibly notable and, in my opinion, just as talented as Meguro. And with Shoji becoming a freelancer recently, and presumably stepping away from the Persona series, I feel like it's necessary to introduce people to those who are in line to take his role. Don't worry, I definitely will be covering Shoji and his legendary career in this series of videos, but first, let's get back to the roots of Atlus and talk about the beginning of the company. Okay, quick Atlus history brief for those unaware. Before Megami Tensei, Atlus developed games for other companies and popular IPs such as Karate Kid or Friday the 13th.
This game is horrible!
You know those shovelware THQ games on the DS and Wii back in the day? Yeah, basically that, but in the 1980s. One of those games was Digital Devil's story Megami Tensei, based on a novel of the same name. Later evolving into series reboot Shin Megami Tensei, that game was the source of everything we know and love from Atlus today. This is where the story of Atlus Sound Team starts for most people. Tsukasa Masuko, who went under the alias of Project Satan, was the composer for Megami Tensei 1 and for most of Atlus's major releases in its first 10 years as a developer. Although this definitely wasn't Masuko's first go-around, as he was hired by Atlus in 1984 and composed their first ever game, Galaxy Odyssey. Early on, I mentioned that one of the most notable aspects of SMT is the atmosphere. And in my opinion, they didn't really hit on this from an art direction perspective until 1992's Shin Megami Tensei. But to be fair, achieving that with the limited technology they had to work with was a big ask. Masuko was up to the challenge, with groovy yet mysterious soundtracks from Megami Tensei 1 and 2. In a 1993 interview with Masuko shortly after the creation of Shin Megami Tensei, he talks about the rapidly evolving sound technology on the newly released Super Nintendo. He experimented with many different sounds at the time and admittedly got lost quite often as the tools for the hardware were still in the process of being created during development. Despite this, 1992's Shin Megami Tensei to this day has some of the most memorable tracks in the series, many of which still pop up in modern SMT games. Historically, Atlus music is known for a high level of variance and cohesiveness at the same time in its sounds. Shin Megami Tensei no doubt had a fantastic score, but I wouldn't personally call it distinct, as there wasn't a specific trait I could really put my finger on when listening to the OST as a whole. In SMT2, however, there definitely is. Now, I won't get into the exact reasons as to why this is for anybody looking to play the game, but let's just say that the SMT2 soundtrack is very law-focused. There's a certain soundbite Masako has used sparingly up until this point that really sounds like a 16-bit choir, and he really likes to use it in SMT2. See if you could spot it in this sample pack. In my opinion, this is really where Project Satan established a sound that truly stood out from the crowd. Alongside the law feel of the OST, it was mixed with aesthetics that I think could be best described as futuristic, again appealing to the setting of the story. This is especially present in the battle themes, which are normally only a minute loop, but don't get tiresome at all due to the uniqueness and intense nature of the music. We're going to skip over SMT If for now, as most of those soundtracks are reused from previous titles aside from a few, and go straight into 1995's Devil Summoner. With this entry, Masako had access to the SCSP, a custom-made Yamaha sound processor that gave the Sega Saturn truly outstanding sound quality for its time. With this new tech in hand, Project Satan created in what my opinion is his magnum opus during his tenure with Atlus. Now on this soundtrack, Masako was collaborating with another composer. Making her SMT debut in this game was Toshiko Tasaki. Even amongst a lot of knowledgeable Atlus fans, she isn't very well known or talked about. But make no mistake, she is a fantastic composer, who created some of the most memorable songs from the game, most notably the Kuzunoha Detective Agency track. Her work would continue in Devil Summoner Soul Hackers, alongside Masako and, yes, Shoji Meguro. We'll get to Shoji's work soon enough, but for now, I want to focus on another major composer in this era before we get to him. Alongside Tasaki, there is another member that I need to introduce, Hidehito Aoki. He is known for producing music from the Megami Tensei spin-off series and composing most of the tracks in Ibon Roku Persona. Megami Tensei is a strategy RPG akin to titles like Fire Emblem. I personally haven't played it yet, but from what I hear, the soundtracks make the slow-paced gameplay less of a slog to get through. Many Atlus composers have mastered blending intense music with something you could legitimately dance to, but I must say that Aoki might have been the best at this. Megami Tensei 2's soundtrack has some of the most distinct features of any Atlus project. What came next for Aoki was largely what everyone knows him for today, as the dungeon music composer for the first ever Persona game. Even though many players didn't hear the themes in its entirety due to the relatively high encounter rate, Aoki was responsible for every one of Iban Roku Persona's legendary dungeon themes, as well as the opening and final battle music. Sadly, this would be the last musical production Aoki would ever create. After leaving Atlus for Sony in 2001, he tragically passed away in a car accident the following year. Although Aoki's work on Iban Roku Persona was its most memorable, there were many others involved in the soundtrack. At this point, Project Satan was no longer involved in new compositions at Atlus, so Persona 1 was the coming out party for not just Aoki, but many members of Atlus Sound Team who would go on to produce some of the most iconic themes that we are still familiar with today. Up until this point, the only member I've seen mentioned who still does work for Atlus is Shoji Meguro. But before we get to him, let me touch on Kenichi Tsuchiya, who hasn't been the primary composer for any modern Atlus titles. Apparently, this is to his dismay, as he jokingly, or maybe not jokingly, calls himself the leader of chores in a Persona 5 interview, as he is primarily responsible for sound effects and cutscene direction, and not really music composition. If true, that is pretty disappointing because he sure has his fair share of bangers even from the early days of Atlus. I neglected to mention SMT If's soundtrack up until this point for this reason, as the few original tracks in that game are some of his earliest works. Even though they could be considered rearranged as they use similar chord progressions as SMT 1 and 2 music, I feel like they are unique enough to have their own identity. With a quick mention of old Sona composers Misaki Okibe and Masaki Kurokawa, all of the Iban Roku Persona team has been introduced. So, who worked on what? As mentioned previously, Aoki was in charge of the dungeon themes. Tsuchiya and Okibe primarily worked on character and overworld themes, as well as the regular battle theme. And filling in the blanks for his first major role in an Atlus game was Shoji Meguro, creating songs like the original Velvet Room composition. With the origins of SMT and Persona addressed, I will use that as a good basis for the rest of this series moving forward. I plan for this to be a 3-part series, with the next episode covering the early to late 2000s in what many consider the golden era of Atlus. I will get to it eventually, but if you want to see that sooner, please leave a like on this video, and if you haven't yet, consider subscribing. Until next time.